It was just after midnight on the 29th of June 1994. American Airlines Flight 901, a McDonnell Douglas MD11, was cruising high above the Caribbean Sea on a long overnight journey from Miami to Buenos Aires in Argentina. Passengers had settled in for the night, the seatbelt signs were off, and the flight seemed routine. But in an instant, the calm was shattered. The aircraft suddenly pitched nose down, plunging nearly 1,000 feet in seconds. Inside the cabin, passengers and flight attendants were hurled towards the ceiling, slammed into aisles and thrown against walls. Screams echoed in the darkness as negative G-forces pinned them to the ceiling. Then, just as suddenly, the aircraft leveled out again. The incident left nearly 20 people injured and raised a disturbing question. How could such a dramatic upset occur in a modern airliner cruising on autopilot in clear skies? The answer lay in one of the most unlikely chains of events in aviation history, an accident caused not by engines or weather, but by the movement of a cockpit seat. Just before we begin, this incident was suggested to me in the comments. I've searched to try and find the original comment, but I cannot find it. But I just wanted to thank you for suggesting it. If you're watching and have an interest in an incident you want to see a video made on, please let me know below. The aim of the channel is to provide never-seen-before air crash investigations or accidents, and if that is what you're looking for, please also consider subscribing to be made aware when a new video is out. Now, on with the video. American Airlines Flight 901 was a regularly scheduled service from Miami, Florida to Buenos Aires in Argentina, a long-haul journey of almost 9 hours. The aircraft assigned that night was a McDonnell Douglas MD11, registration November 1752 Kilo. This was one of the airline's modern wide-body jets designed for long-distance international routes. On board, there were 80 passengers and 17 crew members, 3 of whom made up the flight deck crew. The captain, 58 years old, with more than 20,000 flight hours, and 800 of them on the MD11. Less is reported on the other 2 members of the flight deck, but the first officer was seated in the right-hand seat, who was responsible for flying the aircraft during this incident, and the reserve first officer, who rotated duties with the captain and first officer on long-haul flights. The flight started like any other, with the passengers boarding at Miami for this overnight flight to Buenos Aires. It was a quiet flight with 80 passengers on board. The MD11 can carry 289 passengers, so there was plenty of room in the cabin. The aircraft was fully serviceable, and at 23:33 local time, they took off from Miami en route to Argentina. The weather for the route was calm, with a slack wind and a scattered cloud base around 2,200 feet on parts of the route. After departure, Flight 901 was cleared to climb to its cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. For the critical phase of flight, all 3 pilots were present and engaged, but now in the climb towards their cruising altitude, the reserve first officer relaxed and they started to discuss the rest plan for the trip. The captain was due to rest first, as this meant he would be active and ready for the second part of the trip and ready for the descent and approach. Not long after departure, they reached their cruise altitude. The captain went back into the cabin to rest, leaving the first officer and the reserve first officer at the controls. This was standard procedure on extended flights. Now at 33,000 feet, the MD11 was flying steadily south over Cuba, on course for Argentina. It was a clear night, the weather was smooth, and the autopilot kept the aircraft on course, being monitored by the first officer. With the seatbelt sign switched off, many passengers had loosened their belts or taken them off completely. Cabin service continued, and most on board were either resting or preparing to sleep. Up front in the flight deck, things were quiet. The first officer monitored the flight's instruments, with the reserve first officer occupying the captain's seat, handling radio calls and routine tasks. Then, just after midnight, a flight attendant entered the flight deck carrying a box of drinks for the crew. What followed was a seemingly minor exchange. but it would set off a chain reaction with terrifying consequences. The reserve first officer asked the flight attendant to place the drinks on the footrest of the center observer's seat, but as she tried, she struggled to fit the container into the position. The reserve first officer then attempted to assist, and it became clear that the first officer's seat positioned next to her was blocking the space. Wanting to help, he reached across the cockpit and, without saying anything to the first officer, pressed the seat's movement switch to slide the seat forward. As the seats moved forward, the space was opening up for the drinks to fit in the seat. Just as the gap was nearly wide enough, the autopilot disconnected and the aircraft sharply pitched nose down, throwing the drinks and the cabin crew to the ceiling. Inside the cabin, chaos erupted. Negative G-forces threw passengers and crew into the air. Some were slammed against the ceiling, others collided with overhead bins, seats and bulkheads. Food trays, drinks and luggage tumbled through the air. Passengers screamed as the aircraft seemed to dive uncontrollably. The negative G-force was holding them against the ceiling. Within seconds, the aircraft plunged downward, losing about 800 feet of altitude. But then, just as quickly, positive G-forces returned, pressing everybody back down as the aircraft recovered. In the flight deck, the first officer reacted instantly and regained control. He pulled the aircraft level again, stabilizing it in the cruise. The entire incident had only lasted moments, but it was enough to leave dozens shaken and injured. The sudden dive caused significant injuries among those not strapped in. One passenger suffered serious internal injuries, one flight attendant broke several ribs, and another 15 passengers and crew sustained minor cuts, bruises, and sprains. Dozens more were badly shaken, though thankfully the MD11 itself sustained only minor damage. This was not a structural failure or a system malfunction. It was a human accident that had nearly caused disaster. The captain, who was resting in the cabin during the incident, rushed back to the flight deck to find his crew shaken but the aircraft stable. The flight attendants reported multiple injuries in the cabin, and the captain considered diverting to Kingston in Jamaica. But when American Airlines dispatch confirmed what emergency services were there, they were limited and unavailable at that time of day, so the decision was made to return to Miami. At 0205 local time, barely 2 hours after departure, Flight 901 touched down safely in Florida. Emergency crews met the aircraft, and the injured were taken to hospitals. The MD11 had avoided catastrophe, but the investigation into what happened was just beginning. The National Transportation Safety Board launched a full investigation. The cockpit voice recorder had unfortunately recorded over itself after 30 minutes, erasing the sounds of the incident, but the flight data recorder preserved critical information. It showed that at the time of the upset, the aircraft was at 33,000 feet, heading 159 degrees. In the sudden dive, it lost around 800 feet, and G-forces dropped to as low as negative 0.37 G, before surging up to a 1.85 G as the aircraft recovered. There was no evidence of turbulence, mechanical failure, or external forces. The cause was purely internal to the flight deck. The NTSB pieced together the chain of events. The reserve first officer attempted to help the flight attendant by moving the first officer's seat. This was done without the first officer's knowledge. At the time, the first officer was sat in his seat with his legs crossed behind the yoke. As the reserve first officer moved the seat forward, the first officer was pinned between the flying controls and his seat. His knees pushed the yoke forward, causing the autopilot to disconnect and the aircraft to sharply dive down. As soon as the first officer was able to position himself to recover, he recovered manually and stabilized the aircraft. But unfortunately, passengers and crew were already injured by this point. But the risk to the aircraft and the people on board was over as quickly as it had started. The official probable cause was blunt. The reserve first officer's unauthorized movement of the first officer's seat during flight, which resulted in the first officer's legs being forced against the control column, disconnecting the autopilot and causing the aircraft to pitch down. Beyond the mechanical facts, investigators examined human behavior, and several issues stood out. In terms of flight deck discipline, the reserve first officer acted on his own, without informing the pilots flying and breaking a key rule of cockpit coordination. The presence of the flight attendant in the cockpit carrying drinks created a small but significant disruption. And the incident also highlighted a vulnerability in the MD11 seat and control layout, where a pilot's legs could inadvertently interfere with the control column. The incident was a stark reminder that in aviation, disasters don't always come from storms, mechanical failures, or sabotage. Sometimes it's the smallest human actions that can carry the biggest consequences. Outside of the flight deck, seatbelt discipline was one of the most important takeaways. Despite the signs being off, passengers had been reminded to keep their seatbelts fastened whenever seated. Many did not, and it was those unrestrained who were injured most severely. Crew resource management also came under scrutiny. Communication and coordination between crew members is vital. The reserve first officer's well-intentioned but uncoordinated action nearly caused a catastrophe. And finally, the incident underscored that flight deck distractions, no matter how minor, can quickly escalate. Something as trivial as moving a seat to make space for drinks had nearly jeopardized 97 lives. American Airlines Flight 901 eventually completed its journey to Buenos Aires the following day. For most passengers, it became a story of fear and bruises rather than tragedy. But the incident highlighted how quickly things can unravel in flight. At 33,000 feet in calm skies, a single press of a seat switch led to injuries, panic, and a rapid descent. In aviation, every action matters. Every movement in the cockpit must be deliberate, coordinated, and communicated. Flight 901 proved that even in the most advanced aircraft, safety depends as much on discipline and teamwork as on technology and design. And on that night over the Caribbean, a routine flight became a terrifying lesson in the importance of cockpit coordination and the dangers of taking safety for granted. This was an interesting topic to both research and to learn from. Thank you again for suggesting it. If you found it interesting, please like the video and consider subscribing if you aren't already. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.